So I wrote him and it said, "Hello, Mr. Harkins. I enjoyed reading your thread about my family, although I found it extremely painful. I'm a 53-year-old pastor and community leader in Wisconsin. My parents divorced when I was young, so I don't know much about my G roots. A cousin recently took me to the G grocery store in Conway, and I was blown away. I want to know more about my family. Therefore, I need to connect with the white descendants of Reuben G. Can you help?" This is Reverend Dr. Alex G. with Black Like Me. A number of years ago, I was invited to a G family reunion in Caledonia, Wisconsin. Because my parents divorced when I was young, I really knew little about my G relatives, and I found this to be very intriguing. When I arrived, I saw a poster that took my family all the way back to Henderson G., a gentleman who was born a slave in Leake County, Mississippi. Now, because I grew up in the 70s and watched Alex Haley's Roots, I knew that many black people had descended from slaves. But what I learned at that family reunion was that my name was derived from the slaveholders. And that was the beginning of a brand new journey for me in understanding my family background. I'm introducing this new series on genealogy because I've always been asked about my last name. How do you pronounce it? Is it Meggie? And because my name is not Smith or Washington, I've never met anyone with my last name except for people in my family. So it's always been this source of intrigue, and people have wanted to know more and more about it. So as I've embarked upon learning my own genealogy, it's become an experience that has helped me to understand not only what's happened to the G's, but what's happened to Black American families. How did we get to where we are today? How has our identity been shaped by history, by slavery, by culture? And so as I explore this, I want you to journey with me in understanding how I, as a Black man, see myself in the context of America today and American history as I talk about what it means to live out being a Black man in light of all that's happening in our country and has happened in our country. This isn't new information. Many of us have known about slavery and its impact, but I think in the resurgence of racial hostility and division, it's even more important to understand how we got here. So one way in which we do this is to offer a 9-week U.S. Black History course in order to help people to understand what real comprehensive U.S. history looks like. For this particular lecture, we were going to be studying lynching and the slave trade. And so I talked a little bit about my trip to Mississippi.
But I went down and I found there was a place where a lot of my relatives had settled. There's a stretch of highway between like the Kosciuszko area and Conway and Leake County. And as my cousin was driving me around, it was like their cousin Hattie lived there, and their cousin Joseph lived there. And there were so many of my relatives that this is an actual road. It's called G Road because so many of my family members are there. Now, growing up in the North, I've always been told that the South is a horrible place, racism is crazy. But being here and seeing a street named after my family, and seeing places where my family owned land really did floor me. My father used to tell me that his father, my grandfather, would mention that he had uncles who were white men, blue-eyed white men. Well, in the South, African American people, particularly older African American people, would refer to fair-skinned Black people as white folks. So my mom has freckles, very fair-skinned. She had gray eyes as a child, and so people might just say, you know, look at that old white woman over there, referring to light-skinned Black people. It wasn't, and he said his name was Thomas. It wasn't until I stood in front of this grocery store that I realized this is a real person. Thomas is real, and his name is on this place. And the G's own businesses in this part of town. So the owner of the store is Thomas's granddaughter. Her father's name is Thomas, but her grandfather's name is Thomas as well. Now, I met Mary twice. The first time I met her, Mary G. First time I met her, I was so shocked I couldn't get my camera out of my pocket. Because she said, "Now, who's your grandfather?" I said, "His name is Ernest." And she said, "Yeah, I don't think I know him." So I got in the car with my cousin shocked. And I said, does she know or think we're related? Oh yeah, Mary knows we're related. That's why she was asking you those questions. So I showed Mary a picture of my great-great-grandfather. You'll see me in just a few minutes, not yet. I showed her a picture of my great-great-grandfather, Henderson. She followed me to my car. And she said, could you send me that picture? And I said, why? She said, I've seen him before. I've seen that photograph somewhere.
While re-engaging my own genealogical roots for the sake of my students, I discovered things about my family and about myself that took me on a real interesting ride that I hadn't anticipated.
So with the history class last time, I talked to people about Henderson. This is my grandfather's grandfather on the left. Extremely good-looking man. Here's what I found out when I started researching Henderson. He's a G, but his father was Reuben Joshua G, who raped my great-great-great-grandmother. Her name was Venus. Reuben G is Welsh. His family came to the United States in the early 1700s. He was given the Homestead Act. I found the documentation where it's signed by President Van Buren. He found an African woman in Virginia, because that's where she was born, brought her to Mississippi. And he sired a child by her, and his name was Henderson. But the child on the right is Robert Lafayette G, known as RLG, who was Reuben's oldest son. Reuben and his wife Aurelia stayed together for these years. He had Robert G in 83. Henderson was born in 84, and then Reuben had about 4 other children. I found 1980, 1970 census tracts where Reuben still lived next door to my great-great-grandfather, because my great-great-grandfather became a sharecropper when he no longer worked for his father as a slave. He worked for his father as a sharecropper. And I have to put the real name to it, because he was born in 1854, and although we may romanticize these in some of these nice movies, I can pretty much guarantee you that Venus was not in love with Reuben. To be a slave owner meant that you own slaves. You own their bodies, you own their wombs, you own their breasts, you own their backs, you own their offspring, you own their children. I have to do this to sober myself up, because this is my grandfather's grandfather. This is not like tracing my family back to West Africa. So, one day I decided to Google Henderson's name and his father, Reuben, and I found a post on Ancestry.com from a 70-year-old white gentleman named John. John wrote, I just found out that my great-great-grandfather Reuben had a black son named Henderson. Does anyone know anything about Henderson? I wrote and said, I'm Henderson's grandson's grandson.
I realized that even with some of the transformation that I was sensing in the comments and the body language of the white participants in the history class, it was palpable. I could see they were being changed. I still had a sense that in their minds, this was still ancient history, that we've acknowledged that something happened. But in the same way that we would look at what happened in ancient Greece or Rome and say, wow, that really happened. But what does that have to do with me today? Being able to give names and dates and specific facts about how my name came about, what my parents and grandparents endured, and why I'm doing what I'm doing in Madison in terms of trying to promote racial justice and social justice issues, I needed to use my own story to prove to them that this was not ancient history, that they were leaning in, but they were not convinced that the issues of race and slavery had anything to do with Madison, Wisconsin. So my own journey on Ancestry.com was to bring this topic all the way back home for them, that I am a result of what they've been ignoring. And the systemic realities that they are just now having an aha about has been a reality for me my entire life. One night I decided to Google the names of my great-great-grandfather and his father, Reuben Joshua G., who was a slave owner, in Ancestry.com. And I found a comment from my cousin John. I wrote him, and first thing in the morning, I got this note back from him. Alex, I am delighted to hear from you. As you have no doubt concluded by now, I am totally ate up with family history. Not sure what you have seen that I've written. I believe a phone conversation would be the best starting point. Even though I'm 71, I still come to my flower shop 6 days a week. It sounds like we are fellow travelers. I am very active in the Episcopal Church, and I am a yellow dog Democrat. Not what you would expect from a white Mississippi guy. He kind of spelled out Mississippi like that. Actually, I fled Jackson in 1963 in a hurry, and I would be so happy to talk with you one evening this week. Blessings, John.
And so John and I started talking back and forth, and he started emailing me and calling me Cousin Alex. He said Robert married a woman named Beulah Wilder. I said, wait a minute. Your great-grandfather, Robert G., married a woman named Beulah Wilder. He said, yeah. I said, my grandfather, Oscar G., married a woman named Lilla Wilder. Let's go. So this is what we found out is, Robert is John's great-grandfather. And Reuben is my great-great-grandfather. So we are the descendants of brothers. Now, Robert's children had a completely different life than Reuben's children. But they had the same father. I don't have enough time, enough bandwidth, or enough medicinal marijuana to deal with that. But the fact that black and white G's, while black and white Wilders were having children together, I've got to sit down with either Dr. Kantrowitz or Dr. Clark Pajara and just say, what the hell was going on back in those days? Because what I found out is we're now double cousins. We are G's and we are Wilders. And this is where marriage between blacks and whites was certainly illegal, but raping of black women was not. And the enslavement of their children was not. Now, I say this because I really thought that I was finished a few years ago with race relations. I had really sworn off this kind of stuff. In fact, I look at myself, I tell myself, you loser, you swore you were not going to do this. But this has come to roost in my own family. I'm down with my daughter, and I'm wanting her to understand the strength of our family.
The insidiousness of race relations is that racism was designed to be invisible. Because if it were blatant and ugly and dark, then people would say, this is horrible, let's stop it. And so part of what made me swear off of race relations is I found myself trying to convince someone of something that they didn't believe existed. And so I spent much of my life feeling like I was trying to convey people, look at this photo, there really is a Loch Ness Monster, there really is a Bigfoot, there really are UFOs. Sometimes the concept of racism felt as elusive as that. And particularly growing up in a pseudo-liberal community that looks at you and just says, you're an educated black man who lives in a home he's built in Fitchburg. You're not about to lecture us about the residual effects of racism, are you? You are proof that there was no systemic racism. You're proof that the American dream works. And now you're trying to expose the very America that has allowed someone like you to have success. And that's what made me tired. If people threatened my home or my family, if they lit torches or rode around my home in hoods, I think that would have stoked sort of a fire in me to say, okay, all right, you want to try to push me, you SOBs? Here I come. I'm going to fight for this. But it was with platitudes and smiles and grants and partnership that people rubbed my back and said, isn't it great that you're proof that we have overcome our history? And so I just silently, and some days not so silently, promised myself and my God that I was not going to be a bridge builder or a champion of race relations. It's one thing to study your history to know who you've come from, but I am not sure if any of my studies about my genealogy prepared me for what was about to happen in my life next and the people who were going to step out of Ancestry.com and introduce themselves to me.
John invited me down, and I flew down to New Orleans, and I took my sister and my daughter, and I took one of my team members to record this conversation.
Getting into New Orleans, 10 o'clock on a Friday night with my family, man, it was hot. I'd forgotten how hot New Orleans is. In the summer, we jumped into a lift. The windows were fogged up because we had the air conditioning on and the heavy humidity. And as we drove to downtown to our hotel, I was thinking, I'm in New Orleans, and it's not to go to the French Quarters. I'm not here as a tourist. I'm here to meet descendants who, with whom I share the same blood. What was I thinking coming down here? And I wasn't afraid. They wouldn't have invited me if they wanted to be mean. But what do I say and what do I feel? And if I'm happy, is it forced? And if I'm angry, is it forced? And if I'm happy one minute and then I'm angry, is that understandable? Do I have to justify it? Do I have to explain it? So I remember we had a nice hotel. We got a great deal and got up the next morning, caught a lift again. And we just rode to what I think was called the garden area of New Orleans. And it was beautiful. I mean, the sun was shining, and, it's like these movies you see about the South. Benjamin Button's, the Brad Pitt and Taraji P. Henson movie was filmed like right in John's neighborhood, like right across the street. These beautiful iron wrought gates and trees that were budding, and you could smell the flowers in the air. And I just felt like I'd stepped back in time. It looked like his home looked like a place that would just spill over with Southern hospitality, and our expectations were met. He was really warm on that front porch.
And they're here.
Here we are. Here we are.
This is great. Alex,
How are you?
oh, you get a hug.
It's good to meet you finally.
Let's see, daughter and sister and brother.
This is my daughter Lexi, and this is my sister Laleda.
How you doing?
Okay, that's a neat name.
Yeah, thank you so much for hosting us.
We walked in, and the floors are creaking, and you see all this wood in the house, and long hallways, and the ceilings must have been like these 13-foot ceilings. It was a really, really beautiful home, and it just felt welcoming. It felt like family. But I also felt the freshness and some of his nervousness in bringing black family, still family, but black family into this space.
So, how about we talk about a little structure? After we eat, we'll go upstairs. We've got a library that's much more comfortable to me than the museum that's down here. And so maybe we'll go for an hour and a half and take a break. We've got more coffee. We've got the juices. We have Coke Zero and Dr. Pepper. And
You like the Dr. Pepper?
so, we'll take a drink break, then go back and have another little session.
It's taken me a little while to sort of process something that I sensed, but I couldn't necessarily articulate it. It was really helpful, I believe, for John and his cousin Joan to meet us because they're smart people and they're educated. They're from the South. They're from Mississippi. They know what happened in Leake County. They know what happened on the G property. They know about the rapes and slavery and breeding and all of those things. And I think meeting their black relatives, people who survived that the atrocity of slavery and disenfranchisement and being treated like chattel property, somehow being there gave them a chance to exhale. They did nothing to make slavery work. They had no part in designing that system, but being able to sit down with black relatives who were also educated, who had done well, who did not want anything from them, was not trying to collect on some G inheritance. I think it gave them a sense of peace that they need to know that some of the things that their family did to the black family did not annihilate all of the descendants and did not rob or rape all of the creativity from their black relatives. I could feel them sort of exhale a bit as we sat there. What seemed to me to be just a great sigh of relief that there are folks who are angry with the issues, and terribly disappointed at a country that would allow such atrocities to happen, but that I didn't have feelings of anger or hatred directed at them individually. I think that meant a lot to them. While we were sitting at my cousin John's table, enjoying a great meal, my sister Laleda asked, "So, John, Alex, how does it feel to meet each other and to know that you're relatives, that you're blood kin?" And I think in as much as it was possible, we were so happy to talk about what it meant to find and embrace each other. But I think the reality is that there's so many layers to this that it's going to take me months and years to really process what does it mean to meet the people who are so intertwined into your history but don't really know your story. And here you are having a chance to move ahead in your future. But there are so many things that have gotten you both to that place and to that spot. It was a great question. I still am working on the answer.
So what is this like for you? I mean, historically, as Black people, we know there's white relatives, but to actually be meeting family.
I think just by the way, I've heard about history in general. I didn't think white relatives would be accepting of me. So part of this was because history is so ugly, and Black people grew up knowing that we have some white ancestors. I didn't know how whites would respond. I think that's why when I met Mary G at the grocery store, I was shocked when she said, "Well, who's your father?" And I got in the car and thought, why is she asking me questions like she believes this? So I thought we'd have to somehow prove it and do a DNA test and write this all up. So when John wrote me and started referring to me as Cousin Alex, I just thought, he's serious. He's taking this seriously, because it just, in your head, you just don't know what it's like. It's something you talk about, but you don't sit down at the table together and talk like family. Yeah. That's really fascinating, and it's pleasantly surprising.
Because I'm the result of American history, of American slavery, of really one of the greatest black eyes that America has. We have several. There's so many things that we've done to other folks. I wasn't sure how willing my white relatives were going to be in looking back in history and realizing how we got to this point. I didn't want them to idealize this with sort of the Southern ideology of, this black slave and his white slave master had this forbidden love and they'd steal away to the cotton fields at night when no one was looking. Like, I didn't want it portrayed that way.
Man, when Reuben first took a glance at Venus, he had no idea that 150 years later, that his kids, and from that relationship and from the relationship with his wife, would be sitting around a table talking about him like he was 150 years old. That, to me, that's really wild.
I want people to really understand, when you were a slave owner, you owned your slaves. They were chattel property, which meant that it was shocking that Venus only had one child with Reuben, because it was clear that she was around the G family, the white G family, for a long time. She was born in Virginia. It's where the G's first entered this country. She then gives birth to Henderson, my great-great-grandfather, in Mississippi. His death records show that Venus was his mother, that her birthplace was Virginia. So she was with them for hundreds of miles over decades. And so so I wasn't sure how willing the family, who had just found out that they had black relatives, I wasn't sure how willing they were to really wrestle with how black descendants came into being. That it was really through rape. It was really through violence. That it really was through owning women and their bodies and their wombs and their offspring and their names and everything. And I wasn't sure how my presence was going to trigger that memory for them and what their response would be.
I think the notion that they were under the same roof, sitting around the same table talking, would have shocked them. But not so much.
He's probably turning in his grave right.
But the fact that they would have, but in his mind, they would have been associates in the same neighborhood. You know what I'm saying? But just not socializing on this kind of a level.
Right.
Yeah.
I think I really was more curious about how they would respond to me historically than just me as an individual. Because I figured John and I had interacted with each other. We'd had conversations. And so we knew that we were cool and we're very intrigued by our story. But I think what I really wondered about is once I showed up and they thought this isn't just a nice black guy and we're from the same community and we're like, hey, did you go to this school? Or hey, didn't you play on the baseball team? Then we came face to face, we would have to understand we're descendants from the same person because of brutal rape and slavery. And what does that feel like?
So how about for you, John?
Well, I'm atypical, I think you have to say, for the South and the whole family. You know, I grew up with parents who were just incredibly bigoted, racist, and I was the same thing because you know, as a child, you just parrot what you hear your parents say. I had my great moment of discovery about the time I was a senior in high school, which also parenthetically was the year the help is set. That was my senior year in high school in Jackson. But I had a wonderful young teacher who was also my debate coach when I was a senior in high school, and he challenged me to read John Howard Griffin's book, Black Like Me, and it was just this whole awakening for me, and I've been a yellow dog Democrat ever since. So it's very fulfilling for me to meet you people and you know, find that we're just all folks and we've got a lot in common, much more so than I do with all of my white relatives. I mean, it's great to me. Open up this whole new vista.
Because African Americans cannot afford to be oblivious to the reality of racial disparity, we know it's always there. So even when President Obama was in the White House and I talked about slavery and my family's involvement in slavery, the audience sort of looked at me with this gaze of, but yes, we moved beyond that, right, Alex? But we moved beyond that. Then we fast forward a few years, I give this lecture again, Donald Trump is in the White House, and I see this look of fear and dread from my white participants. Oh my God, are we going back to this place? What I'm thinking is, we never left this place. And so it's interesting how there's always this sort of baseline of understanding race is real and these systems are real. But I realized that with my students, they really thought that the impact had gone away. And then not only were they discovering that we're doing more than taking a step back, we're just showing where we've always been. And it's been really interesting to hear students bemoan that reality. This is something that I, as an African American, wrestle with every day, regardless, irrespective of who is in the White House and what they look like. But it's interesting to see how my white colleagues seem to think that this is a new phenomenon. And so not only do we have the task of understanding what history has meant, the next step is helping people to understand we have not stepped as far away from history as we would have liked to believe.
Well, I just wanted to ask you what it's been like for you meeting black relatives for the first time.
I'm a very emotional person. I can be very unemotional because of my job and all I've had to deal with a lot, as you can imagine. But I believe tears. I'm very happy. I'm touched by this. It's something I never dreamed. What happened? Tears of joy. I mean, I'm just so grateful that you came. I'm so grateful to John, Paul, Sarah. And maybe sometime we'll be able to be together and I can tell you some of my story that I haven't told today, which I choose not to. Sure. I'm also already invited you to come to Memphis. You know, we're honoring Martin Luther King for the 50th anniversary this April.
I want to come down for that.
Well, you have a place to stay, if you want.
I want.
I want you to drive you around. I won't get lost.
Oh, it's the 50th anniversary of his assassination?
Like, just so
18, yeah.
After 50 years of experiencing and seeing things the way I do, and you know, it's not that I feel like my family, my friends are good people and all, but I've just had some experiences and there's just something in my heart that just, I've seen things differently than the majority of the people I've been around.
So does this feel like it's given some, I don't know, credence to, because the work that you've done in civil rights has benefited, you know, the Black community in so many ways, and so do you feel like there's like this full circle kind of coming together, like your life work has, I don't know, somehow been honored in this moment?
Great question.
It's a great question, I would say it. I mean, I want to continue to live life, but I must say that this has just been an affirmation maybe of what I believe is the way we all should live, which is together no matter who we are, what color skin we have, whether we're rich or poor, no matter what faith we are.
Sure.
So tears. I'm happy. I'm happy this happened. I didn't know what to expect. Sometimes John will say I was going to go to Ireland with him. I said, oh, I don't know if I can afford to go. About 4 days later, I said, I will find a way. And we had a great time. So he said, Joan, whenever I invite you to something, say yes. Good things happen.
This flip-flopping back.
But can I answer something before you stop
Yes.
that? To your question with Joan? I think what's interesting is, so Joan, you have this heart to help people who are disenfranchised. But you don't always, as a social worker, get a chance to see the benefit, just like I don't as a pastor. But people have intervened in our lives. There was a coach in my life, might have been a teacher in Lexi's life. We had strong African Americans, mom, grandmother, strong faith. But there were people who went out of their way to tell us that we were smart, we were athletic, we should go to college. And so I'm hoping that in us, you get to somehow see the fruit of your work. That well-meaning social workers or professionals who took an interest in us when it wasn't cool, but because it was just in their heart, it's helped to ignite the ability that was already there. And we don't know where they all are now. We can't return to all of them to say thank you for that encouragement. But hopefully that's a reminder to you that part of your life's work has been with people who may not find you, but you can really rest in knowing that their lives are better because you invested in them.
Well, you know, working in a state government and working in the kind of agency I worked in, especially with, what really filled me up too, I mean, all of the positions I was in, there were things that happened that really filled me up, and it was, you know, meaningful. The volunteer with going out into the community, there's so many good people in Tennessee that want to help. A lot of times they don't know what to do, how to go about
Right.
it. You know, from food pantries to clothes to adoption to foster care. And if you don't help people see that picture, they don't know what to do or they don't know the need is there. And I really like that with foster care and adoption and abuse and neglect, it was a tough job, but there were so many times that things would happen that I just knew. I saw God's hand, and I don't want to say it rewarded me, but it helped me keep going and being positive.
Yes.
Because people have asked me, I don't mean to think I'm just this wonderful person, but they couldn't get over how, no matter how many years I've been there, the quality of what I was doing as far as my working hard on every situation, not, you know, giving up and really looking at the positive. And, you know, if somebody said something couldn't be done, my belief was something can be done, you know, and that you can get past all of that. And that was a challenge for me, and, you know, so there were things that happened and people that have come to me and have said things that, and I think when it really got rough, it seemed like God put an individual or a family or a child in my, you know, my life that really let me know that what I was doing was important. Because, I mean, the need is still really great, but, you know, I don't know, but that explains it.
Sure, it does.
He's been very much with me as far as, my life, and that's made a big difference.
Social work is a calling. I mean, as is all of our professions and vocations. But just having a mom as a social worker and a sister, I just understand what a call it is.
I can't express it enough. And another social worker.
My cousin Joan started crying. And she said, Joan, who's a white family member I just met, because she was a social worker and had always felt a call or a pull to racial issues, to wanting to empower African Americans. Somehow that question in that moment was redemptive, because even though she didn't know her great-grandfather had been a slave owner, or that, part of what the family came to be known for, or wealth it generated, was on the backs of its black slaves, not just the children that Reuben sired, but the children Reuben owned because he purchased them. Somehow I think that was redemptive for her. That there was something in her. The fact that John left Leake County, Mississippi, because the racial tension was so hard, even when they didn't realize that they had black relatives living within a mile or two from them, these two individuals felt something in them that really wanted to bring a sense of equality, which makes me think, are there others who are motivated by a strong sense of social justice issues who might somehow have relatives or something or someone, I don't want to say that they're compensating for, overcompensating for, but is there a reason why certain people have that drive? And is it because somehow it's really within them to make a statement that I know that what's happened historically is not right, and this is my part of making the world?
And at the closing, I said, he was asking me, do they owe you anything? Do you want reparations from them? Because their wealth in the store, those things were built. That wealth was built on the backs of black relatives of my family. But the people who enslaved them is my family. That Welsh blood is in me. But what I said to Charles was, when I sat at the table with John and his daughter, and my beautiful daughter, and she's educated, and I have a degree, and my mother has a degree, and I'm doing things. I'm a published author. I've traveled the world. I've lectured. I teach the doctoral program at Edgewood. I have all these accolades. When I sat at his table, it was very warm, very welcoming. I told Charles, here was my reparations, at least the reparation that John could offer me that day. My whole life, I was raised thinking I had to be there early and there late to prove to my white colleagues I deserve a seat, I deserve that space. My daughter has an academic scholarship and she feels she always has to justify it because it's based on grades and not on race. So there's always this pressure that if you're the first person at a certain level, think about the people in your company, your organizations. We brag that we have a black in this position, but you have no idea how many sidebars they have at the water cooler about how they really got there. And I said, what was magical for me that as I sat there and looked at what my family was able to accomplish, despite the past 120 years from when this picture was taken in the 1880s, 1890s, and I look at what my faith, my strong mom, and my community have provided for me, being able to sit there and not longing to be Robert's child, but being so proud to be Henderson's child, and to feel like it took 120 and 30 years, but his kids have caught up with Robert's kids. And I said, for me, that was reparation that day. And so that was a powerful moment for me to look at just the whole journey of becoming who I am in light of who I might have been had I been Robert's son and inherited the family wealth and inherited the land and got the stores. But in spite of everything that was given to to Henderson, considering that my father was a sharecropper and still picked cotton for a living, that I am the first of Henderson's descendants through his son Oscar, who did not pick cotton for a living. And considering all of that, and that John and I can sit at the table and be where we are in life, and to not be jealous of who he is and what he has, is just a testament to what Dr. Clark Pujara said last week. Defeated people don't catch up with their captors. Defeated people don't sit at the table with their white relatives, eye to eye and at equal status. And so with all the pain of this and knowing that my name is derived from a rapist and a slave owner, I am proud of what my family has made of my name. I am proud of what I'm able to do in this community. And as much as I've been reticent to be involved in race relations, this picture and this reality makes me want to tell folks, our history is ugly, but this is not the end of the story. And we have time to make a difference today, and that's why we're here. We're here to learn this, and we're here to do this. That's why we're here, people. And so let's take these lessons to heart. Let's take these messages to heart. Let's lean in even when it's difficult to hear these ugly truths, because for me, this is not knowledge. I'm related to both of these men. And I've got to reconcile their children, even in this community. But knowing that it's doable keeps me at the table. So as we begin to talk more and more about history, it's not ancient history. You know people who are just a couple of generations away. I'm just 4 generations away. And we've got work to do in this country, and we can't ignore what's going on.
So I'm sitting in New Orleans with my newfound family, and we're talking about history and how we've arrived at this point of meeting each other. And during a bathroom break or something, my assistant, Tyler, comes up to me and says, hey, there's something really serious going on in Charlottesville. I think you need to take a look at it. Well, we were so engrossed in our conversation, we weren't really watching our phones or the news. And so I watched what's happening in Charlottesville with these young men talking about blood and soil in America being taken from them. Now, the juxtaposition of sitting at the table with my white relatives as we are processing and lamenting our families and America's racial history, and then listening to white men lamenting that America had been stolen from them by minorities is just maddening. And the irony was overwhelming, and it made me realize just how much work we have yet to do in the area of racial healing and racial reconciliation. Please tune into part 2 to hear the rest of this amazing story. You can find out how I really processed all of this revelation and what I'm doing with the knowledge of these new relationships. You'll also get a chance to see what all of this has to do with America and American history as a whole.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. You can find out more about Dr. Alex G's amazing work at www.alexg.com. Black Like Me is sponsored by the generosity of the Human Family Unity Foundation.